Hello and welcome to Rauta channel's first worst to best video. Since this is kind of a pilot project of this type of videos, I'm not gonna sure which way this is gonna be. As you know, I'm not gonna edit much, I'm just gonna talk. And I have already picked the order in which way to go and present you these albums. Well, obviously, because this is from worst to best kind of a video. And as such, I'm trying to not go too very deep into the band itself because obviously I'm just gonna basically tell why I think certain albums are better than the rest and so forth. But the reason why I decided to go with Death is that it's one of my favorite albums, bands, which has great albums and basically no weak links whatsoever. If I just took a look on the whole discography, this might be very well the best band in the world if I was to judge based on how much I like any single album. However, I'm not into position to have to think about that, so I'm just gonna feel around a little bit and see how this goes. So, as many of you know, Death is one of the oldest death metal bands of all time. There's an ongoing debate, kind of like which band was first to coin the term death metal, which one was first to play it, and so forth. Some would say Possessed, some would say Death, some would say some other bands. To be honest, that doesn't really matter which one was the first. Death was definitely one of the first ones, however, already started in the quite early 1980s. And it's kind of curious when I decided to go through the Metal Archives discography for the whole band, just in order to make sure that I got the right years, because I wouldn't trust my mind, my memory with the figures. And it kind of struck me kind of in a funny way. And a cool thing is that they demoed a lot. And on the contrary, like of nowadays bands, for example, if you take a look at the Metal Archives site, you can pretty much easily say like it's more than 20 demos they had to do or decided to do before actually doing their debut album. This is something that I kinda miss in the old ages. Bands actually put out demos before entering the studio for the first full-length album or even mini CD or whatever. And that kind of shows that these bands had to, had their work kind of done before entering the studio. I know some bands are still doing that, this kind of demoing. For example, I'm doing that with my band and so forth because it's just, cool way to kind of attract what you're doing. But it's not like you get many bands having this long demo listing, and when you finally put the first album, Scream Bloody Gore, in your player, you understand why it's so goddamn good in the first place. But it's not the album I'm gonna start with. Unlike my previous band related, like why Paradise Lost is such a great band, why Cannibal Corpse is such a great death metal band, type of videos where I went through the discography in chronological order. This time I'm decidedly go from the worst to best. And I know this is gonna be a disappointment for some, and some this might be just surprising, but hey, let's get it going without further ado. As you know, Death didn't release that many albums. There are only 7 full-length albums before the band kind of called it quits and Chuck Schuldiner moved to Control Denied. But those 7 albums are more or less full of gold, some still better than the rest. When I first time heard Individual Thought Patterns, the album right here, I think it was around 1996 or that era anyway. And to be honest, I found it very difficult to get into. I never felt it kind of a grower, even though I later on understand that's exactly what it is. But to me, it always seems like death albums go in pairs, except for the last one. Scream Bloody Gore goes with Leprosy, the kind of old school death metal. Then Spiritual Healing goes with Human, again, a little bit different, but not full blown technical. Then Individual Patterns, Thought Patterns goes with Symbolic, and then the latest album after that, without pair, obviously. But Individual Thought Patterns was an album that didn't exactly have kind of a grooviness that was shared by Human and Spiritual Healing before that. And it wasn't as catchy in a way, even though kind of a technical level was there, as it was with the case with Symbolic. So even though I was giving this whole discography more or less the listening prior to doing this video in a few days here and there, I still feel like Individual Thought Patterns is the weakest link of whole Death discography. It's not so much about the production or anything like that, but it's actually the lack of good songwriting in terms of Death is what they were doing and where they were coming from and where they were going to. To me, it seems like. And I'm not gonna, put any fingers on any given band member, because that was very windy place in the terms of, band members, drummers getting shifted, and same goes with guitar players and whatever. But Individual Thought Patterns is like very skilled album, obviously. But in my opinion, it seems like they were kind of going overboard with that songwriting and technicality. Basically, they were, in my opinion, tripping themselves with these technical ideas, getting really progressive jazz-like almost. And as such, even though it's a good album, definitely, it's one of the hardest album to get into. And still to this date, I mean, like 25 years later, I don't think this album from 1993 is nothing but, the weakest Death album. You have to consider that even though Death was a highly technical band, or still is if you listen to the albums, albums came in a very kind of fast-paced, Scream Bloody Gore, 1987, and the last album's The Sound of Perseverance, 1998. And so there was not like 4 or 5 years break between albums. They were basically coming like in less than 2 years on average, which is quite a fast pace if you think the level of technicality. And back then there was no so many, the level of studio magic wasn't the level it is right now. So whenever you like take a new take, it's gonna take more time than nowadays. So that would be the worst of Death. And now becomes the divider, the great divider in Death discography, because the second worst album, in my opinion, which is once again a great album, is The Sound of Perseverance, the swan song of the whole band. Now, this is the album I got, when I had all the others already. Quite late, to be honest. I don't actually remember which year I got it, but I never felt it was kind of like my cup of tea. Once again, it proved to be kind of a grower, much in the same way as, I guess, Symbolic and Individual Thought Patterns are. But to me, it always felt like this wasn't anymore the Death I used to know. But then again, later, when I give it more goes and all that stuff, I started to like it, but just not as much as many other albums. Actually, I had a really tough choice which one would be the one that actually starts the video, which would be the worst. Because both of these albums are like side by side in terms of quality, in my opinion. With The Sound of Perseverance, I think that kind of moved on, and it kind of would have deserved its pair, which I was claiming they're supposed to be, but it never got there. So it's kind of a swan song which wasn't supposed to, in my opinion, to end the career. But nevertheless, good album, but one of the hardest one to get into. Now, this is also an album some people consider the best of Death, or among the best, but for me it holds position number 5. This one is called Human. Also an album which, in my opinion, is easily better than the two first, well, the first ones in this series, but very much in par with the one I'm gonna talk about next. Now, Human was way more technical than the two first albums, but not that much leap after Spiritual Healing. It has some great songs like Suicide Machine, and in general it's a very strong album. It has this certain grooviness. It definitely remembers its roots, but it's still way more progressed death than we got to know by that time. It's also not that lengthy an album, so it's kind of compact in a way, yet it has all the ingredients to, the reach to kind of a master level of death metal albums. So it was a tough choice to choose between this one and the next, that would be Spiritual Healing. Now bear in mind, by the way, that the level of art kind of changed here. Now, if you can take a look at Spiritual Healing, it's very much like many 80s thrash metal albums and all that stuff, like well drawn, almost like photographic like. But if you take a look at later ones, like Human, it's totally different style, not to mention These Two Babies. And if you remember how Symbolic looks like, it's definitely the same breed. So in many ways, Spiritual Healing was kind of an end of an era, but it was also a start for an era, because it started this more technical approach what death was later known for. So band was always progressing, and Spiritual Healing took a huge leap after Leprosy. And I don't know how people reacted back then. To me, it might have been shock if I started with, in chronological order when I was starting to know death. But since I started to know the band in the 90s, early 90s, I already was kind of late for the first few albums. So I didn't have the shock effect, because I think I got to know the band through compilation at first, or maybe some random album before that, but anyhow. But if you consider how much the band changed with Spiritual Healing, it must have been a shock to some people, a good chance to some, and a disappointment for the rest. Who knows? So number 3 would be Scream Bloody Gore, the debut album of Mighty Death. If you look at, once again, this cover, it's a great cover by, for a death metal album especially, it's nice, like some skeletons with their robes, having their chalices filled with gore or something. It's very kind of a sinister feeling. But back in the 90s, you could just these quotation marks like this Scream Bloody Gore. So things also were kind of naive in a way. Also, if you look at the backside of the album, it's kind of hilarious. It's just so simple. Anyhow, Scream Bloody Gore is, in my opinion, one of the best death metal albums of all time. It has really great selection of killer tracks. Some of them are still a bit raw, considering how many demos they had before that. But still, it's more or less just golden. Some of the tracks, like Evil Dead, are just like perfect. There are some tracks which are not on par with the best tracks on the album, but despite of that, it's like 5 out of stars album. 5 out of 5 stars album, in my opinion. Definitely a classic that is bound to be in the kind of a Hall of Fame of death metal. So why did I choose it to have it on place 3? Well, the obvious reason is Leprosy. This could have been basically the number 1 album, because this is, in my opinion, like upgraded version of what Scream Bloody Gore had to offer. By the way, nice cover all again. Nice way how this picture was drawn, and as you can see, the backside is kind of a more evolved, very 80s stuff, but at least now it has the band pictures and the songs there. But the songs themselves, look at this track list: Born Dead, or Left to Die, Pull the Plug, Open Casket. Just awesome tracks. Basically, the only thing I am annoyed a little bit is the snare sound on this particular release, because it's so overwhelming and it's kind of annoying. Other than that, the production is just great. Schuldinger's voice is just top notch. But the snare sound, what a bitch. But can't have it all, can we? But definitely like with Scream Bloody Gore, one of the best death metal of all time, of all bands. And in my books, the #2 death album, sorry. So, obviously people who have paid attention with what I have been blathering here about is like, this album is gonna be #1. Symbolic. Ugly cover in my opinion, but like I said before in some other review, don't judge the book by its cover. Now Symbolic is in a weird case, considering that I definitely prefer in general the first Death albums above the rest. So why Symbolic, the album #6? Well, to be honest, there is no easy way to answer this without, having to explain myself. The thing is, I have a soft spot for technical metal, be it kind of an origin type of ultra brutal, very technical, and kind of like over the top kind of death metal, or be it this death's very experimental, progressive, almost jazz-like death, or whatever. I mean, I just like when there's this great talent and instrument skills, how to actually create this music. Also the production and the songs, compositions, all the lead solos, whatever, they are just perfect in place. And this is very much a Grower album to me. I mean, for the years past, so many times ago, I never felt that Symbolic would be one of the most important albums of all time to me. Not just in death discography, not just in death metal, but in general. So it took quite a bit of this so-called growing effect to crawl under my skin, and for me to kind of figure out like why this album is so goddamn great. I could just go on and listen to it and find still new places, or like figure like how in the hell they figured out to put this, I don't know, drum beat here, or this kind of a guitar riff there, or this kind of solo lead, whatever. I don't know, but it's definitely one of those albums which I would consider a perfect album if there was such in the first place. So if like Raining Blood by Slayer is the perfect thrash metal album, Symbolic would be the best progressive death metal album. I'm not sure if it's kind of a perfect death metal album as such, because if you compare it to like Leprosy or Scream Bloody Gore, it doesn't really feel that extreme, It's not that much of a classic death metal. But there is no denying that it has very much its roots in death metal in general. And I don't know, maybe if this was their swan song, maybe it would just, be kind of a more tragic, because then there would be this questioning like how they can go beyond Symbolic. Is there a way? Now that I feel Sound of Perseverance is weaker album, yet still a good one, it's kind of a relief. I'm just, like enjoy death discography without, thoughts of like, could they have topped Symbolic? Most likely not. But in general, that discography is just awesome. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, and especially the later albums are more acquired kind of a taste thing. But still, a great band with great albums, nothing but greatness there. So I went through these 7 albums, which I consider to be the full discography, because demos and those doesn't matter so much. You should do the same. I'm not saying you should do it in the order I did. I did in the chronological order. I'm not saying you should do in the order that I here am claiming to be the worst, best. But give those albums a chance. That has clearly deserved it, being one of the best bands of all times. The question remains, what is your favorite Death album and why? Or why don't you like Death in the first place? I'm looking forward for your replies and ideas how to make this worst to best even better. See you soon and stay metal.